Perception, the creation of experience. Sensory systems provide the raw materials from which experiences are formed. Our sense organs do not select what we will be aware of or how we will experience it. They merely transmit as much information as they can through our nervous system. Yet our experiences are not simply a one-to-one reflection of what is external to our senses. Different people may experience the same sensory information in radically different ways because perception is an active, creative process in which raw sensory data are organised and given meaning. To create our perceptions, the brain carries out two different kinds of processing functions. In bottom-up processing, which is our key term, the system takes in individual elements of the stimulus and then combines them into a unified perception. Your visual system operates in a bottom-up fashion as you read. Its feature detectors analyse the elements in each letter of every word and then recombine them into your visual perception of the letters and words. In top-down processing, which is also a key term, sensory information is interpreted in the light of existing knowledge, concepts, ideas, and expectations. Top-down processing is occurring as you interpret the words and sentences constructed by the bottom-up process. Here you make use of higher order knowledge, including what you have learned about the meaning of words and sentence construction. Indeed, a given sentence may convey a different personal meaning to you than to another person if you relate its content to some unique personal experiences. Top-down processing accounts for many psychological influences on perception, such as the roles played by our motives, expectations, previous experiences, and cultural learning. It's a really good idea to look up bottom-up and top-down processing. Perception is selective, the role of attention. As you read these words, which you're not, 100 million sensory messages may be clamouring for your attention. Only a few of these messages register in your awareness. The rest you perceive either dimly or not at all. But you can shift your attention to one of those unregistered stimuli at any time. For example, how does the big toe of your right foot feel right now? Attention then involves two processes of selection. One, focusing on certain stimuli, and two, filtering out other incoming information. These processes have been studied experimentally through a technique called shadowing. Participants wear earphones and listen simultaneously to two messages, one sent through each earphone. They are asked to repeat or shadow one of the messages word for word as they listen. Most participants can do this quite successfully, but only at the cost of not remembering what the other message was about. Shadowing experiments demonstrate that we cannot attend completely to more than one thing at a time, but we can shift our attention rapidly back and forth between the two messages, drawing on our general knowledge to fill in the gaps. Inattentional blindness. Electrical recording and brain imaging studies have shown that unattended stimuli register in the nervous system but do not enter into immediate experience. In the visual realm, scientists have coined the term inattentional blindness. That's a key term, and inattentional blindness is to refer to the failure of unattended stimuli to register in the consciousness. We can look right at something without seeing it, as if we are attending to something else. In one study, several experienced pilots training on flight simulators were so intent on watching the landing instruments, such as the airspeed indicator on the plane's windshield, that they directed their plane onto a runway containing other aircraft. In another instance, research participants who were counting the number of passes made during a video-recorded basketball game did not notice a woman wearing a gorilla suit who walked across the court, even though she remained in clear sight for more than 5 seconds. And I have done this, and I didn't see the gorilla either. That's amazing. And then when they played it back and showed that there was a gorilla there, I still didn't believe it. I had to actually go back to what I'd watched the first time to see that there was actually a gorilla there. Inattentional blindness is surely relevant to findings that mobile phone conversations significantly reduce driving performance in experimental studies. It's a bad idea to drive and talk on the phone at the same time. It's also a bad idea to drink and drive, as alcohol ingestion increases inattentional blindness. Environmental and personal factors in attention. Attention is strongly affected by both the nature of the stimulus and by personal factors. Stimulus characteristics that attract our attention include intensity, novelty, movement, contrast, and repetition. Sexually oriented stimuli are especially attention-grabbing. Advertisers use these properties in their commercials and packaging. Internal factors such as our motives and interests act as powerful filters and influence which stimuli our environment we will notice. For example, when we are hungry, we are especially sensitive to food-related cues. A botanist walking through a park is particularly attentive to the plants. A landscape architect attends primarily to the layout of the park. People are especially attentive to stimuli that have relevance to their well-being, a tendency that clearly has biological survival value. This tendency is shown through experiments in which researchers measure how quickly people focus on and react to threatening versus non-threatening stimuli. Thus, people are quicker to identify an angry-looking face in a crowd than a smiling face. If a fearful face or figure is projected on one side of the visual field and a neutral face or figure on the other, measurements of eye movements show faster movements toward the fearful stimulus, indicating the capacity of threat-relevant stimuli to capture visual attention. In the sport of cricket, batsmen often have to avoid bowled balls aimed at their bodies. In an analogy of this process, Geoffrey Lynn and co-workers seated participants in front of a video display, then measured their reaction times in response to spherical images that sped from the background. The observers had significantly faster reaction times when the speeding object was coming towards their heads than when its trajectory would barely miss their heads. The investigators suggested that humans have developed a special visual system that unconsciously triggers protective responses to stimuli that are interpreted as threatening. As a real-life illustration of this principle, they point to the 2008 incident, shown in figure point 526, which is when an Iraqi reporter hurled his shoes at US President George Bush during a joint news conference with Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Commenting on this scene, Lynn stated, "If you look at the shoe throwing video, you will see that the Prime Minister doesn't flinch at all. His brain has already categorised the shoe as non-threatening, which does not require evasive action, but Bush has categorised the shoe as threatening and triggers an evasive dodge, all within a fraction of a second." Advertisers are adept at using attention-grabbing stimuli to attract potential customers to their products. Figure 5.27. Sometimes, however, the process backfires, as in the following case. And that's the figure 2.5. So a famous model glides down a staircase, removing articles of clothing as she goes. Once inside the car being promoted in this British advertisement, she removes her knickers and flings them out the window. The only problem with this wildly popular ad? An informal survey by a Welsh psychologist revealed that the visual image was so compelling that virtually no one remembered the brand of car being advertised. Perceptions have organisation and structure. Have you ever stopped to wonder why we perceive the visual world as being composed of distinct objects? After all, the information sent by the retina reflects nothing but an array of varying intensities and frequencies of light energy. The light rays reflect from different parts of a single object have no more natural belongingness to one another than those coming from two different objects. Yet we perceive scenes as involving separate objects, such as trees, buildings, and people. These perceptions must be the product of an organisation imposed by our nervous system. This top-down process of perceptual organisation occurs so automatically that we take it for granted. But Dr. Richard, a prominent psychologist who suffered brain damage in an accident, no longer does. There was nothing wrong with his eyes, yet the input he received from them was not put together correctly. Dr. Richard reported that if he saw a person, he sometimes would perceive the separate parts of the person as not belonging together in a single body. But if all the parts moved in the same direction, Dr. Richard then saw them as one complete person. At other times, he would perceive people in crowds wearing the same colour clothes as going together rather than as separate people. He also had difficulty putting sights and sounds together. Sometimes the movement of the lips did not correspond to the sounds he heard, as if he were watching a badly dubbed foreign movie. Dr. Richard's experience of his environment was thus disjointed and fragmented. God, imagine going through life and seeing everything like that. How disorientating. Gestalt principles of perceptual organisation. In the early 20th century, psychologists from the German school of Gestalt psychology set out to discover how we organise the separate parts of our perceptual field into a unified and meaningful whole. Gestalt is the German term for pattern, whole, or form. Gestalt theorists were early champions of top-down processing, arguing that the wholes we perceive are often more than, and frequently different from, the sum of their parts. Thus, your perception of the photo in figure 5.28 is likely to be more than people on a cricket ground. And the image is people on a cricket ground, all dressed in pink, but they have formed the shape of a girl, like you see on the toilet doors for male and female. A pink lady silhouette. The Gestalt theorists emphasise the importance of figure-ground relations, which is a key term, our tendency to organise stimuli into a central or foreground figure and a background. In vision, the central figure is usually in front of or on top of what we perceive as background people from head to end. And I'm not sure if it's meant to be backgroup people, because backgroup people is all one word, but the group and people is sharing the P, and head to end is to end, they've put as one word. Nice editing. It has a distinct shape and is more striking in our perceptions and memory than the background. We perceive borders or contours wherever there is a distinct change in the colours or brightness of a visual scene, but we interpret these contours as part of the figure rather than the background. Similarly, we tend to hear instrumental music as a melody, figure, surrounded by other chords or harmonies, ground. So melody is the figure and harmonies are the ground, background. Separating figure from ground can be challenging, yet our perceptual systems are usually equal to the task. Sometimes, however, it's not completely obvious what's the figure and what's the ground, and the same stimulus can give rise to two different perceptions. And there's a figure 5.29, which is on page 176, and it's of two telephone boxes side by side, but there's actually a man standing in front of one of them, all in grey, but he has the red crisscross painting on him, so he sort of blends in. And figure 5.30 on the same page is that image of either two faces looking at each other or a vase. So it continues to say, so consider that figure with the faces vase. For example, if you examine it for a while, two alternating but equally plausible perceptions will emerge, one based on the inner portion and the other formed by the two outer portions. When the alternative perception occurs, what was previously the figure becomes the background. In addition to figure-ground relations, the Gestalt psychologists were interested in how separate stimuli come to be perceived as parts of larger wholes. They suggested that people group and interpret stimuli in accordance with 4 Gestalt laws of perceptual organisation, which is a key term: similarity, proximity, closure, and continuity. These organising principles are illustrated in figure 5.31, also on page 176. To describe them, the first image is basically columns of circles. The first column is black, the second is white, the next one's black, next one's white, so on. But it looks like a square. We would take it in as one whole square. Another image is a circle that's broken into 3 pieces, but we would see it as a whole rather than 3 pieces. And another one is like a crisscross line, which I guess we see as an X, rather than 2 lines crossing over each other. So in the first one, it says, if you see columns, your perception obeys the Gestalt law of similarity, which says that when parts of a configuration are perceived as similar, they will be perceived as belonging together. Well, not me, I think I saw this whole square. The law of proximity says that elements that are near each other are likely to be perceived as part of the same configuration. The one with the circle is the law of closure, which states that people tend to close the open edges of a figure or fill in the gaps in an incomplete figure, so that their identification of the form, in this case a circle and a triangle, is more complete than what is actually there. And finally, the law of continuity holds that people link individual elements together so they form a continuous line or pattern that makes sense. Thus, figure 5.31D is far more likely to be seen as 2 smooth lines crossing at X rather than 2 V shapes touching at X. Oh, okay, so I explained that incorrectly. I thought we just saw an X. Or consider Fraser's spiral, which is not really a spiral at all. So I would look that up phrases spiral. We perceive the concentric circles as a spiral because, to our visual system, a spiral has better continuity between the individual elements than does a set of circles. The spiral is created in our interpretation of the stimulus. Perception involves hypothesis testing. Recognizing a stimulus implies that we have a perceptual schema, a key term, which is a mental representation or image containing the critical and distinctive features of a person, object, event, or other perceptual phenomenon. Schemas provide mental templates that allow us to classify and identify sensory input in a top-down fashion. Imagine, for example, that a person approaches you and calls out your name. Who is this person? If the stimuli match your internal schemas of your best friend's appearance and voice closely enough, you identify the person as your friend. Many political cartoonists have an uncanny ability to capture the most noteworthy facial features of famous people so that we can easily recognise the person represented by even the simplest line sketch. Perception is, in this sense, an attempt to make sense of stimulus input, to search for the best interpretation of sensory information based upon our knowledge and experience. Likening perception to the scientific process, Richard L. Gregory suggested that each of our perceptions is essentially a hypothesis about the nature and meaning of the sensory information. Now there's a figure of a cube with the top of the cube or the front of the cube is blue, like a transparent blue. So if you stare at it, it's called the Necker cube. It is what is called a bistable percept because the depth information in the image is ambiguous. Therefore, the visual system can generate two equally plausible depth interpretations and it alternates between them. So if you stare at it for a while, the blue part will eventually become the back. So it looks like you're looking into the box. I can only see it if I look up to the left. If I look back down to the right again, it becomes the front of the box. Perception is influenced by expectations, perceptual sets. During a Middle East crisis in 1988, the US warship USS Vincennes, I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, was engaged in a pitched battle with several Iranian gunboats. Suddenly, the Vincennes' advanced radar system detected an aircraft taking off from a military civilian airfield in Iran and heading straight toward the Vincennes. Radar operators identified the plane as an Iranian F-14 fighter, known to carry the lethal missiles used earlier in a damaging attack on another US warship. Repeated requests to the airplane to identify itself yielded no response. The plane was now only 16 kilometres from the ship, and according to the crew watching the radar, descending towards the Vincennes on an attack course. When a final warning evoked no response, the Vincennes captain gave the command to fire on the plane. 2 surface-to-air missiles streaked into the sky. Moments later, all that remained of the plane was a shower of flaming debris. The jubilation and relief of the Vincennes crew were short-lived. Soon the awful truth was known. The plane they had shot down was not an attacking F-14 warplane, but a commercial airliner carrying 290 passengers, all of whom died when the aircraft was destroyed. Moreover, video recordings of the electronic information used by the crew to identify the plane and its flight pattern showed conclusively that the aircraft was not an F-14 and that it had actually been climbing to its cruising altitude rather than descending towards the ship. How could such a tragic error have been made by a well-trained and experienced crew with access to the world's most sophisticated radar equipment? At a hearing on the incident, several prominent reception researchers reconstructed the psychological environment that could have caused the radar's operators' eyes to lie. Clearly, the situation was stressful and dangerous. The Vincennes was already under attack by Iranian gunboats and other attacks could be expected. It was easy for the radar operators, observing a plane taking off from a military field and heading toward the ship, to interpret this as a prelude to an air attack. The Vincennes crew was determined to avoid the fate of the other warship, producing a high level of vigilance for any stimuli that suggested an impending attack. Fear and expectation thus created a psychological context within the sensory input from the computer system was interpreted in a distorted manner. The perception that the aircraft was a warplane and that it was descending toward the ship fit the crew's expectations and fears, and it became the reality that they experienced. They had a perceptual set, which is a key term, and a readiness to perceive stimuli in a particular way. Sometimes believing is seeing. Global focus. Culture can impact the way we perceive the world. Imagine you are looking at a street scene. Do you tend to look at the individual objects in the scene, focusing on their individual characteristics, such as their size and colour, or do you tend to look at the scene as a whole, focusing more on the relationships between the objects, such as where they are relative to each other? Focusing on the individual objects is referred to as local or analytic processing, while focusing on whole scene is global or holistic processing. Interestingly, one's culture has been shown to influence the extent to which people engage in local or global processing. For example, East Asians and Caucasians typically differ in their local-global preference, with East Asians showing a global bias. This was shown by McCone and colleagues in a study that used Navon letters. See Figure 5.34 on page 177. The letters are designed so they can be processed either locally or globally, and the local and global information can either be consistent or inconsistent. They are composed of small letters, example A's or T's, that are arranged to make a global shape that is either consistent, example A's arranged in the shape of an A, or inconsistent A's in a T with the local letter. So it's all capital A's and they are in the shape of the letter T. The global information is the T, which is inconsistent with the local information, which are the A's. Typically, participants respond to the presence of a target letter, which can be presented at the global or local level, and response time to detect the target letter is measured. In the study by McCone and others, the participants were not instructed to attend to the global or local level. Instead, they were allowed to attend freely to either level, and the targets were equally likely to occur at each level. This allowed the authors to measure response times to both global and local letter targets, and consequently measure whether each participant had a preference, i.e. a quicker response time for processing stimuli at the global or local level. They found East Asian participants had a global preference, while Western participants had a local preference. The finding supports the results of an earlier study by Nisbet and colleagues that used a completely different approach. They asked people to describe photographs of various scenes and found that East Asians tended to focus on the scene as a whole, describing the type of scene, example rural or urban, and the relationship between the objects in the scene, while Caucasians tended to focus on the individual items in the scene. These findings are consistent with the notion that East Asians have a bias for global processing the scene as a whole at the expense of local processing of the individual items, while Caucasians focus on the local elements, the objects in the scene at the expense of the global relationships.